Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and welcome back to another edition of Starter Builds for a new league. This time around we are starting on Bestiary League, and I've got a few builds just to give you as starter builds. Now bear in mind these are just pretty generic and somewhat safe choices as always, just to get going in a league so that you can get to low level maps, maybe even scale your character into much higher level maps if you put the right investment in, and then maybe move on or pick another character if you're just not that into this original one. Now they do have the potential to go all the way, but they should just at least get you to low tier maps, maybe even mid tier with almost no investment whatsoever. And as always, they will be pretty similar to old starter builds, just because that's what works. That's basically what's decent early on, and just to get a league going. I will also feature just a couple of discussion points about the new skills, Spectral, Shield, Throw, and Tectonic Strike. That is going to be completely provisionary, got nothing to do with real starter builds yet, because we don't exactly know too much about how they're going to work, and it's going to be up to the testing process. But to begin with, the first character I want to recommend is a Dual Strike champion. This footage you're seeing is the Dual Strike Berserker that was pure elemental at the end of Abyss League that I played, and the skill itself is Dual Strike. Now Dual Strike is pretty strong because you do have a threshold duel that covers the melee splash aspect of it. Ancestral Call itself has made Dual Strike and many other skills much more viable than they used to be for the clearing, and a lot more comfortable. This character does not have to be Dual Strike by any means. This will be a fairly basic template for a character that can use a lot of different skills, including Reave, Blade Flurry, Ancestral Call, with many other different skills as well. But for the purpose of this little setup, I will be focusing on Dual Strike. Now the character will be pure physical. It is planning to use swords, however you can customize it to other weapon types, other ascendancies, whether it's full elemental or full physical to elemental conversion. But for the purpose of this little starter, I am planning to go champion because I think it is actually quite strong with the recent changes. Pure physical because I think that is just a nice start, easy start to get going with the types of weapons available from uniques and just swords in general, and then the Dual Strike gem itself, because as I mentioned, it is, I feel, in a pretty strong place with its single target as well as its clear, giving it sort of a good middle ground between your Blade Flurry and Reave, whereas Reave is the biggest sort of area and Blade Flurry probably the best sort of single target. A good strong Dual Strike build should be kind of in between both of those, and in this case it should be fairly tanky as a champion, fairly good DPS given that it will be crit swords with the potential for Abyssus, and overall I think should be a really nice character. So I'll jump right into what this one involves. So as I have mentioned, I feel like this should be more of a template character, as a lot of these are physical and just attack based builds these days definitely are, so use it as a bit of a guideline to what you might be able to do with your own characters, with your own ideas. Because it doesn't have to be Dual Strike, can very well be Cleave, can very well be Reave, Blade Flurry, Ancestral Call with Molten Strike, with Heavy Strike, just a lot of different things. But the template that I'm going for here is a crit-based build based off of a champion and using swords, and currently all you really need to start with are probably some scavers. It doesn't have to be scavers, you can get different rare weapons. The faster the better. A bit of crit goes a very long way, and eventually you might be able to build into a better weapon, something like this one. This entire template is based off of the Gladiator Reave and Blade Flurry character I played at the end of during one of the races a few months ago, so you can just rip that straight from the build list as I have and then customize it as you need to. But currently we're looking at something like 1,000,000 damage. Now this is going to be against Shaper, something like 1,000,000 damage with pure Dual Strike. You're attacking with both weapons, so there are no stat sticks. And the reason for going champion, and why I'm excited about champion right now, is because you get quite a lot of armor and evasion while you have fortify up, which should be basically all of the time when you're leap slamming around or whirling around with the fortify attached to it. You then get an insane amount of damage and hit overcapping from your worthy foe, which is enemies you taunt take 20% increased damage, and enemies taunted mean they cannot evade attacks, which when you actually hit something means you will be getting 100% chance to hit and 20% increased damage to that enemy. And then paired with first to strike, last to fall, that is the adrenaline node, as well as the intimidate, which gives you 10% damage. If you do manage the adrenaline correctly, which I imagine we're going to be doing by activating an aura with blood magic just before a fight, or righteous firing just before a boss fight, you get huge amounts of damage as well. Now, I'm not currently planning for that because I don't know how reliable that will be to actually use, but if you tick it, you can see there is quite a large damage gain. But at the moment, just purely what champion is doing for us is mostly this taunt node over here and this fortify node. So you want to play around with path of building and what champion does. You can see that currently it gives us a good third of our damage or so, and it is a really reliable starting ascendancy, I feel, just based off of the fact that the first 2 points you can grab are going to be Unstoppable Hero, 1000 armor, 1000 evasion at low levels, slap a fortify in somewhere, and all of a sudden you will be just about unkillable through most of the leveling phase of the game. So the build will, as I mentioned, rely around swords. Scavers are just a good starting point. A Star Conjurer is a very solid helmet, but if you want to build a little more defensively, an Abyssus is going to be your best in slot by far for damage. Belly of the Beast, probably just a solid choice for life, especially early on, and then pretty generic life, resist, and damage, physical damage sort of gear. You don't need to worry about accuracy at all, like my previous character here did. Series Promise, Alliance Raw, both go a very long way for your damage. Might and Influence is the threshold jewel we're building around, so with the Might and Influence jewel, you have some offhand splash damage, meaning you don't need to use melee splash in your setup, and another 20% chance to deal double damage with the main hand. So the overall setup then becomes something like this: Dual Strike, Melee Fizz, Ruthless, Multi-Strike, Maim, and increased critical damage. And you're going to use Ancestral Call, probably in place of Ruthless or Maim a lot of the time. And if you really need extra crit, then run Crit Strikes instead of crit damage. But ultimately, crit damage is probably going to be a bit higher. It really depends on the gear you have available to you and the weapons you're going to be using. So keep in mind that there isn't always a one fit best scenario. But early on, you grab Ancestral Call, you can level with some Molten Strike, probably going to be a bit better until you have your Dual Strike jewel. And as well as that, sorry, there it is. As well as that, you can probably try out a lot of different skills, like I mentioned, and maybe you'll find different ones that you like just a little more. So we also get Frenzies through Blood Rage in this build, and then single targeting with Frenzy. You'll probably attach Frenzy to a Fortify, as well as your Leap Slam and a faster attacks. That's how you're going to keep up Fortify a lot of the time, and the Frenzy charges during boss fights. Now, to begin with, if you're going to level the character, the first Ascendancy you're grabbing, I think, should be Unstoppable Hero. Doesn't have to be, but that will probably make the game incredibly easy to level with. When you're leveling, just pretty straightforward tree here, and I think I would recommend, for the most part, going left, because that's where you get a lot of strength, which fills out quite a bit of life, and then a few sword nodes. You don't necessarily have to commit to sword nodes early on, because you might not have the correct weapons, so bear in mind that you don't necessarily need to use things like swords from the leveling process, but you're trying to focus on some physical damage weapons or whatever has damage, and it should be fairly smooth. Next up, I wanted to hit you with the Ice Shot Barrage Ranger, and in this case, it's going to be a Deadeye, whereas the first time I made this character quite a few months ago was a Raider. Now, Raider is still a strong choice, but Deadeye has been revamped and looks like it should be a really meaty option for a character like this one. Due to the attack speed, it's going to gain the accuracy, the additional projectile, the area, as well as pretty decent run speed as well. It'll probably be potentially a little bit slower, but should gear up quite nicer throughout the early phases of the game, and potentially, I would think, ramp into a beefier character in the absolute endgame. The build itself revolves around Ice Shot for your clear skill, Barrage for your single target, which Deadeye has a decent buff for, and it's pure physical, going into quite a lot of cold and stacking a lot of cold damage. You do also use a Chin Soul to try and get quite a lot of additional single target happening in the early game especially. Now the issue is bow starter characters are notoriously not that great to start with, but I think a lot of that is fixed up by having a strong shrapnel shot option early on in the game, so you will probably be leveling quite early on with shrapnel shot as well as ice shot and barrage, so use a lot of those interchangeably as you see fit. But as well as that, you do then have the Deadeye option, which gives quite a lot of early utility to these types of characters that don't really have a lot going for them with the gear. So you get quite a lot of evasion if you just grab this, for example, as your first 2 points. 1000 evasion early on means you're going to be borderline unkillable. You get a bit of movement speed and all of that as well, so you can then focus more onto offense if you want while having this. Otherwise, you can start going into far shot, which will give you quite a lot of damage early on from decent range potential, and then grabbing endless munitions figures out a lot of your accuracy, a good chunk of area for the ice shot or the shrapnel that you're leveling with, and then an additional projectile which helps both your ice shot and your barrage feel better. And then you also have fast and deadly, which is quality of life for your blink arrow, your mirror arrow. If you feel like taking that early on, I don't think there's any right choice, but all of this is stuff that really helps early on for your character before you have insane amounts of gear. And the passive tree itself is fairly straightforward because most bow build passive trees really are. They just start typically as a ranger, and then they go around grabbing all the cool shit. This one, however, is elemental and cold based, so you are going to be grabbing a lot of the ele nodes, some of the cold nodes, and ultimately you take point blank so that you tank things a bit more, and it cancels out over far shot, thus doing a bit more than far shot. And then you go up this shadow tree as well. Now the character will be based around a Chin Soul, a Death's Opus, for clear, most likely in your main hand, and a Chin Soul in your offhand, quite likely just for pure barrage single target. But you can also use any number of physical bows, including Lionized Glare, though I think Lionized Glare is probably less of a good choice for a build like this, since you get so much accuracy from Deadeye. The main perk of Lionized Glare, being hits can't be evaded, isn't really that strong anymore, I don't think. So something like a Death's Opus with a Chin Soul as a single target option when you're really up close is probably the way to go. Besides that, the gear is nothing too special. Wise Oak early on, and obviously a Dying Sun if you can get it in the absolute end, and its Ares Promise, and then just try and get some nice elemental damage with attacks, maybe a bit of fizz, maybe a bit of cold. Across the board, it's not too hard to gear. A Barely the Beast is going to go a long way to filling out your life, though previously I was using an Iriel's Fostering, not really necessary in this type of setup anymore. You can go many other chests, but a Belly of the Beast will of course fill out your life fairly comfortably. Now currently all of these DPS numbers are against Shaper, and this is off of a 5 link I believe, so Barrage here has a 5 link. It's running Ice Bite because you do scale a lot of cold damage, and we will keep our frenzies up through the Ice Bite on both Barrage and Ice Shot, and then also a single target frenzy, just hitting things, bosses whenever you need your frenzies. And as I've mentioned in previous videos for this type of character, Chain is the end goal for Ice Shot. I believe it feels a lot nicer, but early on, Pierce is probably going to feel better, and it's quite likely that you're going to be running, or you want to run, the Ice Shot Threshold Jewels with the Pierce instead of Chain, and Chain is only something you replace your Pierce with when you start to have good enough damage and you're high enough level, and the Chain actually helps your clear rather than just nerfing your damage and making it feel worse. So level up Chain while you're doing the Pierce sort of stuff and try it out every now and again. Eventually it should feel a lot better. Now this is the 5 link here. Ultimately it will be Ice Shot, LE damage with attacks, Chain, GMP, and Ice Bite. Until you get Chain and start using it, use something else like Hypothermia, Slower Proj, Added Cold. All of that is totally fine, or the Pierce gem itself. And as far as Barrage is concerned, we have Barrage, Added Cold, Ice, Elemental damage with attacks, and Ice Bite. Cold Pen is your last one, and then LE Focus is your absolute last one for pure single target. You will be using a Frost Bomb. Try and put that down underneath enemies and bosses at all times because it does give you quite a lot of additional damage. Vile Lightning Trap just to shock things, and you do run Hatred and probably Herald of Ice attached to Assassin's Mark Curse on hit, as well as Onslaught for your mana reservation. I do have a video about this build from quite a few months ago that I'll link if you want more details, but of course, just go through the path of building and check things out yourself. Now, last of all, as far as the starter builds are concerned, I do absolutely always feel obligated, at the least at the moment, while it works the way it works, to give you a Scorching Ray Trickster as an option for a starting character for the league, just because it is always so goddamn solid, it plays so smoothly, and it requires so little. Trickster did get a mild rework for something like Scorching Ray this league, so it should be a little bit more exciting to play. Overall though, the Scorching Ray characters and Tricksters in particular, to start with, are very defensive, pretty damn offensive as well, and require very little in the ways of gear to actually get any sort of start in your league, and I do still recommend them as the premier caster if you're going to play a caster option for your league starter. However, these days I'd say the Hierophant Totem casters can definitely compete too, and there should be plenty of those floating about from other streamers and other video makers, so I decided not to give you one of those and just go over the Scorching Ray Trickster once again. So this specific build has been a feature for my starter build videos for probably 2 or 3 leagues now, because as I said, Scorching Ray is for me pretty satisfying as a character and a really strong start, because it should take you all the way to endgame, all the way through Elders and Guardians and all that, if you scale it that way and want to take it to the end game. The character itself is really basic. There's not much involved in your gearing process. You just try and squeeze as much life and resists out of your character as much as possible. And as far as the actual ascendancy changes are concerned, it did, I think, get a little buff, as there's a slightly better damage over time node here now as well, and some of the mana stuff got combined. So overall it should have maybe a bit more mana and just have a bit more damage, and should be a really smooth character to play, as well as having the 2% of max life on kill, which we previously didn't have, so you should be able to get into the thick of things just a bit more this time around. Now, the passive tree is very straightforward. You can't really screw it up, but I do recommend trying your hardest to get to Elemental Overload and Elemental Equilibrium as soon as possible, because they are going to be huge damage boosts for your character once you get those, and an Orb of Storms attached to an Arcane Surge. Place your Orb of Storms before you attack just about anything with Scorching Ray, and you will get huge damage boosts from doing so. Now, Scorching Ray you can get from level 12 onwards, and it's about level 18 once you start get the first support gems from Act 2 that it starts to really feel good, so don't be too dissuaded when it's not too amazing early on. Once you get those support gems happening, it definitely becomes really good, and the support gems you're looking for are Controlled Destruction and Elemental Focus early on. Then you get Burning Damage, Efficacy, and Swift Affliction, and play around with this if you need to see which ones are going to be the best, but you definitely get these two at least early on, and they're huge damage multipliers, so then all you're really trying to get at that stage is going for Elemental Overload, Elemental Equilibrium as soon as you can, and then of course you can run a faster casting up until you get the other support gems in these early levels. Overall, we do also grab a Mind Over Matter as a huge defensive boost. If you have everything up and all your bonuses and buffs, like in this character, 400 or so mana regen sustains your Mind Over Matter quite a lot and quite healthily, and then also we get mana on kill there and some mana sustain from Weave the Arcane. It should be a fairly fast playstyle for a Scorching Ray character compared to maybe some of the other options out there. Should be very tanky with lots of life and lots of life regen, and the gear is very straightforward. Not even too sure what we're doing for a flask slot to replace the Witchfire Brew that we no longer have, because vulnerability is not amazing. No real curses are going to be super amazing, except for potentially just slapping in another Despair or an Ellie Weakness, because against Shaper, he's very curse, resistant. So either of these don't particularly matter too much. We already have an Orb of Storm's flammability, and maybe we don't even want another Blasphemy Curse in this setup anymore, given that it's going to take mana, and it's not that good against Shaper anyway. So a second curse, that's something I'd say is up to you at the moment, and can play around with taking off, but it could still be worth it. And the only real uniques we're using in the build are Immortal Flesh, because huge amounts of life and mana regen, very cheap and very easy to get, and should help your survivability quite a lot too. And the Doriani's Catalyst has been a very nice staple for these Scorching Ray builds. but you don't have to get one. Can always just grab a scepter or a dagger if you want to start whirling blading. If you want to use some Comb's roots instead, then you probably want a whirling blade instead of shield charge, but I will leave that up to you guys. Now, we don't have the Unshattered Will from the Harbinger shield anymore. What you're looking for on a shield is to be a fossilized base, some good spell damage, some good cast speed if possible, and a bit of life. Not a very steep requirement overall, but it should be somewhat achievable to get the higher end of shield if you really try and get your own. Now this time around, that is actually all the starter builds I'm going to recommend. Just 3, 1 ranged, 1 melee, and 1 caster, which is the Scorching Ray. So I don't really like casters as starters too much myself, unless you actually do something like Essence Drain, Scorching Ray, or Totems. Otherwise they can be a bit finicky. And at this point, I think they are just more or less templates. You can go a champion just about anything, I think, and a Deadeye just about anything. What I'm going to pick as my starter, I'm not really too sure yet. I'm probably leaning most towards the Pog champion, because I really do want to play my first champion and try and scale some of these physical melee attack type things, but I could very well end up choosing my Deadeye character or my Trickster Scorching Ray. I haven't really made up my mind. Now the other things I did want to show you are my potential build for the Spectral Shield Throw. Just quickly, I'll link this and talk a bit about it for you, but I honestly have no idea how this is going to go. Spectral Shield Throw itself, or this build or this tree. It's a very quick passive tree I've made up as a Deadeye, which seems like it should be a decent enough start as a Spectral Shield Throw character, because you do get a bunch of accuracy, projectile damage, and a few nifty things like an additional projectile, which doesn't do too much. Potentially the chain, if you don't want to use chain in the actual setup, then you could do that, or you could stack both if that ends up being better, so that's something to keep an eye on. So possibly we don't need endless munitions and we grab Ricochet instead, but the idea here is that for me, I think Spectral Shield Throw is going to be more of a clear skill, and then you're going to combo it with a nice single target as well, like a Blade Flurry, or probably a Molten Strike, since we are scaling a lot of projectile damage. So it's just something to keep your mind around. I don't think it's going to be the be-all, end-all skill. It's probably going to be more like a Kinetic Blast to a Wander, where I think it'll farm pretty well and it'll be pretty fun to play, but you're going to need a different skill and something kind of hybrid that you're building around. So something like a Molten Strike, quite potentially, but it's fairly hard to build around since you can't use any specific weapon nodes for it. The crit's going to be kind of shit, and this is just the passive tree I've got so far. It's the best I could do off of just a few minutes notice and without actually being able to play around with the skill yet. So that one's a bit interesting. I wouldn't really recommend it as a starter. Going into Shield Throw, I think you can very easily just chuck on Shield Throw in, let's say, the champion character and give that a feel and see how you like it, because there should be a bit of generic scaling in there anyway. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is the Tectonic Strike. I don't really know what that's going to look like either. For the most part, we're going Jugs, because we want that endurance charge beefiness, as well as a bit of accuracy and defensiveness and all that. And the one I've made up here is just a simple Doomsoul one, so non-crit with Ellie Overload, and you just simulate using a Infernal Blow for now. Without actually touching the skill, without actually feeling it, without seeing how it is, I just cannot possibly give you an actual build for it. That would be pretty irresponsible, but I think a non-crit build would work just fine. Something like a sword one with Doomsoul, an axe one with ultimately a series disfavor. Maces should be fine. Even crit ones will probably work out with all kinds of different crit weapons and all of that. It's just too early to tell, I feel. Maybe the skill will even be garbage, but currently this is the one I've got just as a quick little mock-up. Non-crit, does have some fire scaling, has plenty of life and all that, and goes into Avatar of Fire and Elemental Overload. So I'll drop that one into the link as well, but no real idea if it's going to be good, and there are a lot of them out there that can be just generic enough, and you can try to build into and see if you like Tectonic Strike. Maybe it's not going to be very good, and you just turn your Jug into some crit-based character with an Abyssus and save him, no worries. Similar to my Dual Strike champion, similar to any sort of Reeve Blade Flurry character that does currently exist. Jug should just be a very nice, easy, generic melee attack build with an Abyssus, because there's plenty of countering for the Abyssus in there. So Jugs should be very easy to build around if you fuck this up. And Tectonic Strike just doesn't feel good, or the build itself doesn't feel good. And that's all I'll say on this and that other subject for now, guys. Just a few little starter builds. They're always pretty much generic, the starter builds. You can, if you really want, and I do recommend it if you're a bit lost, to just go to my build list, Mathil build list V2. You can click on the Harbinger League or the Abyss League itself and scroll through these characters, any that kind of tickle your fancy. Click any one of them, grab the Path of Building paste bin, chuck it straight into your Path of Building up here, and then you can just simply play around with different ascendancies or different gear, because most of these characters should work even on lower gear scales and just with some different ascendancies, and quite a lot of them should work with Champion, I think. So if you want to just build maybe a Champion or a Deadeye, just adjust some of those builds to these ascendancies, and it really should be fairly reliable way of picking just another skill, another build, or giving you some fresh ideas for things you currently don't really know what to do with the league start of the new league, Bestiary League. In any case, guys, thank you very much for watching. I need to get a bit of sleep before the actual start of our Pokemon League, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you very much for watching. Good luck in your league, and take it easy.